So strategy is usually a prefix that is kind of used or announces that something is just more important than something else. We hear all the time about strategic affairs, strategic actors, strategic positions, strategic research, a big thing in our field, for example. And so there's lots of use of the term strategy, but there's actually not always a lot of strategy behind it. And in my world, strategy in the kind of political and to some extent military world implies some kind of calculated relationship of means to large ends, which is essentially an idea about how to develop and use resources to secure some overarching goals. And I think the main difference to, for example, business strategy, which I deal with to some extent, is that in the business world, the interest, what you want to achieve is pretty clear cut. It's usually some kind of profit or economic growth. While in the political realm, it's not that clear what your main interest is, what your goal is. So a big part of strategy in the political or diplomatic field is actually to identify your interest, what it is you need what kind of goal you want to reach. And from there you start then with what you need to do to reach that. And this could be what kind of problem you want to solve, what kind of security threat you want to manage, for example. And these strategies, they can be, it could be a paper, things, for example, about the long telegram from George Kennan about containment during the Cold War. But it can also be a culture, a pattern of behavior. So it doesn't have to be something that is written down. And for most actors, it's actually more important to kind of be strategic, to have the ability to constantly think about how you combine your goals and ends, rather than to have an actual strategy. We hope to reach both. We actually want to publish some kind of document with a strategy. You'll help us today, and that is our aim also of this project. But of course, we also want to make the EU a more strategic actor in this field. That is part of our job. So just a few characteristics of strategy. First of all, especially when we're talking political strategies, the state, and increasingly for some 200 to 300 years, the nation state is the main kind of owner or principle of a strategy. So it's a very state-centric concept in the political world. And the main goal, quite traditionally, has been to uphold your sovereign standing. And that is usually referred to as a grand strategy. It's the most important aspect of any kind of state strategy. Other actors have strategies as well, but they usually have more challenge to kind of allocate resources, the means to reach their goals. But I would say that is pretty much changing now, and nation states or states in general quite often today see that the means that they need and the resources they need to reach their goals are actually held by other actors, the private sector, the universities, individuals, companies. We have Elon Musk flying around in space rockets, etc. So it's a very different strategic field, and perhaps you could say that it's actually less state-centric today. Second, it clearly departs from interest. If you don't know what you want to achieve, if you haven't identified your interest, you really can't have a strategy, or your strategy will do nothing for you. Third, a strategy needs to be kind of reflective of your environment. It is an alignment between means and ends, but it should also reflect the environment in which a strategy should be played out. And this also, which I'll come back to, opens the front for the future. Usually a strategy is meant to impact some elements in the future. So you need to know not only the present interest, but also you have an idea about what the future would look like in order to have an effective strategy. And then finally, strategy is almost always executed under conditions of uncertainty and scarce resources. And that's why you talk about strategic intelligence, the kind of information you need to write or to uphold your strategies. But that will never be perfect, the information condition. So strategy is almost always executed under conditions of uncertainty. And as I said, the future is one important aspect in strategy, because that is what strategy will deal with, always the time ahead of you. But the past is also an extremely important ingredient. That's usually where you have the data. about past choices and how they worked out. And I mean, strategy is in itself, it's a Greek word, it comes from a Greek word. And if you look at the way they did strategy in the old ancient Greeks, they had their historians, and they were extremely instrumental by the time. They knew when they would write their history in ancient Greece that their history writing would be used. That was at least the understanding by then for future strategy making. So the history part was very clear already then, but they also used the future, or trying to use, for example, the oracle in Delphi, getting different visions about the future to help them out to solve current day problems. So the kind of the past and the future has always been a kind of integrative way of strategy. I'm gonna just show you an image because I think it's beautiful. It's not as clear, but we'll have a 30-second competition. So please write in the chat with 1 or 2 words what you think you're looking at here, and you can win a strategy award. You don't have to guess, but then you can't win. Okay, no Google searching on images or something. No cheating. Okay, time is up. So what you actually are looking at here is an yeah, I got a few replies. I have to watch. Strategy to get fruit. Ways to improve trees. That is pretty correct. What you see here is an oak plantation, so the short history here, we are in the 18th century. Sweden was running out of oaks, what was until then known as crown oaks. They were owned, all oaks in Sweden was owned by the king, and he used them to build ships for the navy, so we can keep track of the Russians on the other side of the Baltic. In the 18th century, these trees were increasingly, due to an agrarian reform, the king needed to give up the idea that he owned all the oaks, so he gave them to the agrarian sector to buy power. But then he didn't have any oaks, so they enlisted a young scientist and asked them, like, how can you provide us with oaks for building our navy ships? And this young scientist, he went around Europe and learning the trades and tricks of oak farming. And we built these huge oak plantations on a nice island in the middle of Sweden, very protected, where all the trees were bent and cultivated according to different hull parts of the ships, essentially like an IKEA furniture, but 250 years ago. And they were supposed to be assembled into a nice fighting ship. This was a great idea. I guess this was science for diplomacy, if you work with these concepts. Unfortunately, it took about 200 years for these oaks to be ready. So in 1970, the Director General of the Swedish Parks and Forestry Agency could report to the General or Admiral of the Navy that your oaks are now ready. Unfortunately, then Sweden hasn't been in a war for 150 years, and for about 100 years by then, we built all our ships in steel. So there was no use for this amazing plantation. So what to learn from this? Well, even if you get some aspects right, they clearly planned for an existing need. They had pretty good track of the past. They had a vision of the future that was half correct. We would still be kind of worried about the Russians. We would still want to have a naval presence in the Baltic, but we totally missed the idea of technology. And also the willingness of Sweden to fight wars, actually. So we got some things right, some critical elements totally wrong, and we ended up with a pretty failed project. Now, it wasn't a waste. Today, we use these oaks to build the floors in our embassies around the world. So you can say that we reinvested this resource in kind of perhaps soft power rather than hard power. So not a total waste. But for me, this is a nice illustration to show that we always used the past and a vision about the future when we plan and when we have strategies, but we can do it more or less successfully. So I'll just go a little bit more into the details of how this strategy can be planned. Let's see, now I can't change that. So let's start with history, how you actually use history for your strategy. Well, first, the fact I'm not an historian, and of course I'm a political scientist, and we use history more as a prop. It's to adding some kind of flesh and nerve to our kind of methodological or statistical models or whatever. But fortunately, you have a lot of real serious historians here in the project, and you'll be helped out during the day. And I know before to learn more about history than you ever can from me. But just to say something about how history actually has been used in strategy making, one way is to use history to motivate and mobilize in a strategy. Well, I mean, this is a very traditional field. History was, of course, for example, in the Balkan Wars, history was an extremely important motivating factors. In my field, I'm doing mostly European affairs and EU integration. History is always extremely present as an ingredient to motivate and to mobilize. For example, the constant reference to Greece as the kind of cradle of European integration and civilization during the Euro crisis, essentially used as the way to mobilize other actors to accept things that they wouldn't otherwise with references to history. So that is one kind of use of history. Another, of course, is history as bias. That decision making is affected by our understanding of history, and that it may be correct or incorrect, but things that we hold as truths will guide our decisions, whether we actually know it or not. But then, of course, you can think about history as an actual source of knowledge. Because obviously humans usually learn through trial and error, and an average person has actually quite a limited experience of grand strategic decisions. So in the field of strategy, we really have a strong incentive to try to learn from other people's trial and error. And that way, history has actually been very important, especially in the field of strategy making. And of course, we learn from different directions. In the UK field, it's very kind of directed towards the classics, and that's also how their education has been built up. In the US, politicians has been very affected by more 19th century European politics, the power balance, etc. We can see Kennedy, for example, that constantly went back to these issues and tried to learn from them. But this is, of course, quite different. It's difficult today to know whether you are in a kind of Chamberlain moment where appeasement will fail, or whether it's a Bay of Pigs moment where caution is more warranted. So history is not a guide, but it can, of course, offer warnings, although there will always be simplifications and advices of possible consequences that you are likely to meet if you take a specific course, a strategic course. And this is something you will work with also today, where we try to integrate your historical cases and what you can learn from them when you give strategic advice in the current. We will not work as much with the future today, but it's an important ingredient. So I want you just to know about it, that there's different models, of course, of forecasting, of strategic, scenario planning that is quite common in the field of strategy. And this is really a way of learning more about yourself, perhaps, than about the future. There's a French futurist who says that the purpose of looking at the future is to disturb the present, which I think is a good way of, that is one way of using the future to really challenge what you think you are today and what you believe today. And it's a way of kind of stress testing your current choices. What if they in the 18th century in Sweden would actually have sit down and thought, because we were producing lots of things in Sweden of steel. If they had just imagined a future where we also were building ships of steel, they would have saved themselves a lot of money, but they didn't. And when you think about the future in a more kind of structural way, you usually try to divide factors into some kind of baseline factors that you think will kind of stay the same or increase in kind of linear trends. and then to separate what we call often critical uncertainties, things that could flip either way. And a very common way to think about the future is to pick two of these critical uncertainties, whether it's population or European integration or whatever, and then you make a 2x2 matrix, and then you have 4 different futures. So that's just one way where it's very common to think about the future when you formulate a strategy. But the main focus of today will be actually the history. So, okay, now I have just a few minutes left, and the focus now will be on a strategy for the EU and to some extent for the European countries. And yesterday I spoke about the European science diplomacy ecosystem, the actors, the interests, and of course the powers of science diplomacy. And today we will kind of take it one step further and try to formulate at least elements of a strategy, the objectives, what to do. And the EU, of course, have lots of strategies for itself, for its institutions, for its member states, for its external affairs, for cities, for regions, for whatnot. There's no lack of strategic papers in the EU, but there is quite often a lack of actual strategy. But science diplomacy is an area where we neither have a paper called a strategy or perhaps an actual strategy. So you will make lots of value. You will add value in this project, or helping us to add value by working on this, because I think it's much needed. So again, if strategy is a very basic idea of where we are heading and what we need to do to get there, today we are focusing on what we need to go do to get there. Yesterday I spoke about some of these diplomatic goals that the EU might want to achieve, where they could have help of science. And you can agree or disagree with that. It doesn't really matter for today. Now we were looking at what the EU actually could do to strengthen its science diplomacy. And I've supplied you with a few kind of suggestions. And these are really kind of empty shells of strategic objectives. These are action points for how the European science diplomacy could be developed to better serve European diplomacy. And today you need to help me out to kind of flesh these out, to add historical warnings, advice, or to question them and say that, no, they are totally meaningless. But then I want some good arguments for that as well, why we shouldn't go in this direction. And there's 6 of these, and you find them in kind of full length in the policy paper that I know that have been supplied to you. Otherwise, you'll find it on the drive. And your case study authors that you've been spending time with, they have helped you to pick out, I think, 2 each for you, for your groups that you will work with. But the full 6 is what the EU could do right now to strengthen its kind of science diplomacy capacity, is to strengthen a free and vibrant European scientific community, agree principles of scientific cooperation in an era of regime divergence and competition, something I know you discussed quite a lot yesterday, foster the capabilities for a culture of scientific advice and foreign policymaker, increase cohesion in EU level efforts, increase cohesion among EU and member states efforts, and leverage potential science diplomacy facilitators, the universities, the companies, everyone else in this world, in this, at least in the European ecosystem that deals with science diplomacy. And I know with your case study authors, you will work with number 1 and 2, and I think 5 and 6 in different constellations. So what's going to happen now is that as soon as I stop talking, which will happen very soon, feel free to ask any questions about this. But then after that, we'll have a short break, and then we'll have coaching sessions where you will spend some time with me and I think a few of your case study authors, and also Rasmus, and then you can take the chance to also ask us more about these objectives. And I guess especially for me, since I'm the author of this, about what they mean, how they interact. And there's also a few guiding questions to each objective in this policy brief, and to Rasmus, who's definitely an expert on this, how to use history, and he knows more about your cases as well. And I'm sure he can add more on that. what we want you to do is, in practice, is the following. And this is your task. So your assembled team of science diplomat practitioners, that's you, in your groups, you received an official request for strategic advice on progressing towards the selected objectives, the 2 of these 6 that have been chosen for you to strengthen science diplomacy for Europe. And so relying on insights into a historical case and the understanding you've developed of actors' interest, interactions, and outcomes, formulate advice for how these objectives could be achieved. And this advice could outline specific fields of actions to be taken, the basis on which they could be implemented, how they are recommended, and particular points of vigilance here. And we're looking forward to about a 10-minute presentation later in the day. Your draft strategic advice will be given to a senior practitioner in your specific area, who will also give feedback to you. And again, there are some specific kind of questions that you can use to get more to think about this field in the policy brief, but they are only there to kind of inspire discussion. You don't have to relate specifically to those questions in the policy brief if you don't want. And feel free to be very critical. And again, if you want to also argue that no, this objective is really not a good one, we should do something, we should not go that way, but then please argue for that. And also remember the kind of first rule of strategy, which is that the opposite to what you suggest, if that's not actually an option, you don't have a strategy, you're just stating the obvious. So the opposite to what you suggest should also be an option. A strategy is always a choice. It always has consequences, and not all of them will be in your favor. And that is also part of strategy, how to manage the negative consequences, the collateral of your choices. And again, as I said, you'll discuss this with both me and Rasmus. Me and Rasmus will help you out. I'm pretty sure that we will have a different perspective on some of these objectives as you will have. So just make your choice and argue for your case. There's no right and wrong here. It's just better or worse argued strategies. So this is the task for today.